All right, well, we are finally starting the life of David. We were supposed to actually do this during the last session, which I've had several people ask since Brett's pregnant, are you going to be able to do the class? We are still doing the class, but it was supposed to be scheduled for the last time, so I don't want people to think, well, you're heartless. You scheduled this right for the time when your wife is giving birth. So that is kind of where we're at on this. But we are going to start this. And today, I have kind of put these slides together. So I thought with some of the other classes, a lot of people always ask for the material as well. So there is this website right here in the middle. And if you just go to that little location, and it is case sensitive, but that is on the bottom of every slide. So if you are interested, if you want that information, feel free. You can just go to that website. Just type in goo.gl. And that, by the way, that is an L. That's not an I or anything like that. That is an L, a lowercase L. But the rest of that, if you go there, that will have the slides for the entire class. So I wanted you to have access to that if you want it. Okay, so, that is presenting right. Inside of our class right here, we are going to be talking about David, obviously. And when we look at David, we have to realize a couple things. That, first of all, David is mentioned more in the Old Testament than any other person. There's more dedicated to his life. We have the Psalms, which give us a lot of his innermost thoughts. And not only that, why is that not advancing? Sorry. There we go. He's mentioned 62 times in the Old Testament. And not only that, also in the New Testament. He's mentioned 59 times in the New Testament too. So if you look for a biblical standpoint, David's mentioned more than almost any other individual that we have in the Bible, period. And there seems to be a lot of modern day people doing a lot of bashing of David. And I kind of want to caution us on that, because the one thing I want you to think about, if you had every aspect of your life documented and all of your innermost thoughts written down, and you had someone observing that, how good are we going to turn out in that light when people are examining that? And I think if we start thinking about that, we need to give David a little bit of credit on there, because there's a lot of good things that David did during his life as well. So when we're looking at this, what are some of the stories that pop into your head when we talk about David? David and Goliath. That's usually the first one that pops in people's minds. What's another one? David and Bathsheba. And it's ironic. Those are usually the top two things that people think of. Okay? And it goes without fail. Those are usually the two stories that come to people's minds. And it's kind of interesting because it's an interesting contrast. David and Goliath, very good moment. David and Bathsheba, very low moment. Okay? What are some of the other moments that pop in your head when you talk about David? That's Samson. That's Samson, yes. What's that? What was Saul? Well, Saul hunting David, for lack of a better word. We got that? Yes, sir?
When he was in the cave hiding, and Saul went in there, he did not do anything to Saul, and Saul was trying to kill him.
Right. And we will hit that a lot more in detail, but you're right. That's a very, very pivotal moment, too.
The friendship between David and Jonathan.
That's another one that we'll talk about, too, yeah. Because that is a good relationship that those two individuals had. And a lot of people kind of have changed that perspective, and we'll hit that later when we get there, too. What are some other ones? Yes, sir? Oh, yeah. And we will talk about Absalom as well. And that one, is that a high point of David's life or a low point in David's life? Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because if you look at some of the relationship that David had with Solomon and some of the things that David does for Solomon towards the end of his life, you have some really good parenthood aspects there. But when we talk about David and Absalom, there's definitely some low points there. All right, now, the one thing that we have to talk about, a lot of people, even though when we mentioned David and Bathsheba, a lot of times when you say David is a man after God's own heart, a lot of people will say, well, how is David a man after God's own heart when he has some of these flaws like David and Bathsheba? And if you look in the New Testament in Acts 13 and 22, it says, after he had removed him, he raised up David to be their king, concerning whom He also testified and said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my heart, who will do all my will. So the important thing to kind of come out with that, too, is if you look at how God remembers David, no matter the fact that we remember David and Bathsheba, David and Absalom, and all of these things, when you look at God's memory of David, David was a man after God's own heart. And when we kind of look at that, I found a record or a quote that I kind of liked. And this is from Charles Swindoll. He said, having a heart for God doesn't mean you're perfect. It means you're sensitive. It means every detail is important. And when you see you're wrong, you face it. You own up. You come to terms with it. And I think if we kind of think of this quote, and if we kind of keep this in the back of our minds, when we start applying this to how David is a man after God's own heart, I think you'll kind of see David was a man after God's own heart. Every failure that David has, David always kind of admits his wrongdoing at some point. And we'll kind of hit that too. Okay, now, a couple things just to kind of put this in perspective in terms of a time point where we're talking about. We are kind of right here in this middle section right here with David. So we're going to kind of start with the end of Saul's reign. So we're going to kind of talk about this 970 aspect, actually closer to 1010 BC throughout that little time period. Okay, now that just kind of gives you a general idea of where things are at. And while we're talking about this too, kind of want to mention, if you were looking in a Jewish Bible, you're going to find a couple things. First of all, you don't have a book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. You have a book of Samuel. All right, and inside Samuel itself, Samuel's book is kind of broken up into the 1st and 2nd kingdoms. All right, and that's kind of important just to realize in terms of someone, if they ever ask you, well, how in the world did we get 1st and 2nd Kings? Or 1st and 2nd Samuel, we broke it up based on that earlier division. And kind of if you look at this, 1st and 2nd Samuel goes along with 1st Chronicles, right? And kind of Chronicles, same thing. We've broken up 1st and 2nd Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah. That was all one book as well. 1st and 2nd Kings, you have the other half of it, and that kind of matches with 2nd Chronicles. Some interesting things with that. 2nd Chronicles pretty much omits the entire northern kingdom. The only thing that they really mention about Saul is Saul's suicide. So that's really the only thing that we have mentioned there. All right, now, when we're talking about this, there's two questions to kind of consider. And the first question is this. If God has removed all of the unnecessary details out of the Bible, then should we learn more about Bible geography? What do you think? Do we need to learn anything about Bible geography? Let's think about that for a second. Inside the United States, if I said something about the north, what automatically comes into your mind? If I said, we're going up north, we're going to go to Minnesota, what starts to come into mind? Or does anything come into mind? Snow. There we go. Thank you. What else? What's that? The Mall of America. Yeah, you could do that. How about the weather? What type of weather do we have? We have snow. You have a lot of rain. If I mention something about Washington, D.C., what comes to mind if we talk about Washington, D.C.? You talk about the White House. Without saying anything about the White House or anything, if you just mention some of these locations, it automatically starts to pop things into your mind, okay? And if you look in the Bible, if you look at how the authors are actually mentioning locations, and one thing I will say, if you've never noticed the number of locations mentioned in the Bible, it's kind of interesting. If you start noticing the locations, you can't unlook at it, or you can't not look at it. It's there, and there's lots of details. And the one thing, when we're talking about the Bible geography, there's a lot of things that will come to mind to these people that we need to kind of realize. And here's the other part. If you don't know geography, will you miss important details? You can, okay? And that's not to say that you have to know everything about geography to understand the Bible. I'm not saying that at all. But there are some things that you have to realize. And the one thing I will point out, I'm going to give you two examples of this. The first one is when I was teaching a class, a high school class. There were some students in my class, and we were talking about the different religions, different world religions, and we had just kind of discussed Egypt, and we were talking about the Nile and the importance of the Nile. and then we hit Judaism. And then one of the kids said, "Hey, Mr. Hagedorn, what does the Jordan River look like?" And I was stumped because I grew up right by a river, grew up by the Missouri River, and the rivers I was familiar with was the Missouri River and the Mississippi River. I could tell you a lot about that. So when I was looking at different things, and I kind of want to point this out. Let's go to Joshua 3, actually. And in Joshua 3, let's go to verse, one second here. We're going to hit verse 14 to start off with. Actually, yes, 14. Says, so when the people So when the people set out from their tents to cross the Jordan, with the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and when those who carried the Ark came into the Jordan, and the feet of the priests carrying the Ark were dipped in the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks all the days of harvest, the waters which were flowing down from them stood above, one even a great distance away from Adam. Now, if you kind of look at this, I always kind of looked at this as this is the poor man version of the Red Sea crossing, okay? I always thought, oh, Moses, they crossed a sea. That's pretty important, okay? And the one thing is, when you start looking at this, here is the Jordan River, okay? This is the Jordan River. This is the Jordan River at flood season. Now, I will point out in this picture, the Jordan River is now dammed, okay? So I want you to think about that because the Jordan River used to flow a lot faster, okay? Now, that is not a very wide river at all, okay? It's not like the Missouri or the Mississippi where you can kind of walk in and wade in, okay? It is a very fast-moving river. You can see that right there. There's lots of rocks in there. And the one thing you have to realize with fast-moving rivers, it cuts a path in there as it goes. So it's also really, really deep, okay? Now, I want you to think about this. When Moses crossed the Red Sea, how did God do that? What's that? He did part it. Did anyone touch the water at all?
No, they went on dry land.
They went on dry land, but Moses had his staff. The water parted before anyone got there. If you look at this story here, when did God actually part the water? When they put their feet in there, okay? And you not only that, but you have the Levites carrying the ark, okay? So you're going to notice in the Bible it doesn't mention anyone saying with the Levitical priest, I was the one that carried it last week, it's your turn. You don't see that at all. But you see them, and they step their feet into this water, and you can kind of see if this will go. How in the world? Jared, could you hit request access on that? Because here's a video. This is when it's a little calmer. But, oh, what's going on here? We signed in as Ben on this one. If it doesn't work, don't worry about it. We can think the picture worked well. Okay, so there's a video of that. If you want, you can watch this video. Basically, the Jordan River, you can cross over it with a pole vault if you look at it. But the important part with that, again, there's some details in there. And if you understand that the river is a flood stage, you have people actually putting their foot in. And there's a little bit of faith there, okay? The minute they stepped in, either the water was going to part or they were going to drown, okay? And that's important. Now, the other part that we have with this one is in Matthew. Okay, we'll look at the New Testament on this one. And Matthew 4:13. And this one, a very small Bible passage, but there's a lot of interesting stuff here. It says, and we're talking about Jesus here, it says, and leaving Nazareth, he came and settled in Capernaum, which is by the sea, in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. Now, if you look at this, we'll see there is Nazareth right there, okay? Capernaum is over here by the Sea of Galilee. And if you look at that, most people, and I'll be honest with this, I used to glance over this and just kind of like, oh, 2 locations, and can skip across this. But there's some interesting things to kind of consider here, okay? First of all, Nazareth is a very, very, very Jewish city, okay? They don't allow a lot of outsiders in there. Okay? It's also a lot more isolated, so you don't have a lot of people coming in. But if you look at Capernaum, and if you think about this, Capernaum's right on the Sea of Galilee. Okay? It's a port city. What do you know about port cities? Very busy. Okay? Very busy. Shipping. Okay? There's a lot of people coming in and out. Is it going to be completely just Jewish people there? No. Okay? So if you think about that, why is that going to help Jesus' ministry by going to Capernaum? He's going to meet people. Not only that, when he tells people things, it's going to spread like wildfire because it's not just an isolated city. Okay? And there's tons and tons of things like that in the Bible, but that is some of the ones that you kind of have to consider. Okay? And if you look in the Bible, there's tons and tons of things like that, and we'll kind of talk about that too. Okay? So we're talking about this little region. We are going to be looking, the Middle East is right here in this little area. To zoom in, we've got it a little bit more with some current locations. But the locations that we're going to be discussing are these locations over here. First of all, there are 4 bodies of waters that we need to know. First of all, you have the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean Sea is this little part right here. Okay? It is the biggest part to kind of connect Israel to other locations. You're going to have a lot of people that are coming in through this body of water. Specifically, in our little study, the Philistines. Philistines are not a local people. Anytime they come through, they're going to go through the Mediterranean Sea to get to land, to come across. The other thing that we have here, we have the next location, the Sea of Galilee. Okay? The Sea of Galilee is here. Okay? Now, the interesting thing is, in the Sea of Galilee, is it mentioned a lot in the Bible? Yes. Specifically, Old Testament or New Testament? The New Testament. Is it mentioned in the Old Testament as the Sea of Galilee? It's not, okay? But I want to point out that it is actually there. Go to Numbers 34. So we're going to see this as location 2. Okay, in Numbers 34:11. Says, and the border shall go down from Shephaim to Riblah on the east side of Ain, and the border shall go down and reach to the slope of the East Asia, the Sea of Chinnereth. Okay? One thing, if you're going to kind of make a notation, do you see where it says Sea of Chinnereth? Or it's also Sea of Kinnereth. Both of those you'll see, depending on how your Bible is spelled, either a CH or with a K. That is the Old Testament name for the Sea of Galilee. Okay? Some of these locations change names. So depending on the audience that you're looking at, that will change. Okay? And that's, what's that? Chinnereth. Okay? And you'll see that occasionally in the Old Testament, but if you ever see Sea of Chinnereth, it's the same thing as the Sea of Galilee. Okay? Then, in the middle, or actually towards the bottom down here, you have the Dead Sea. Okay? And the Dead Sea right there, there's some important things you need to realize. Okay? Why do they call it the Dead Sea, first of all? Nothing lives in it. Why does nothing live in it? You're right. The salt content. Okay? The one thing I want to point out, if you look up here at the Sea of Galilee, there is the Jordan River that goes all the way through here. There's an outlet. When you're talking about the Dead Sea, there is not an outlet at all. The water just evaporates. Okay? It basically all just flows downhill, and it does evaporate. So when you're talking about nothing lives in there, yes, nothing lives in there. Dead Sea, people can float on it, okay, because the salt content is so high. Okay, so if you ever see videos of people there, you'll see them, they're floating on the water, and it's kind of interesting. The salt content is ridiculous with the Dead Sea. Did you have a question?
I just want to make a comment.
Sure.
But water there in Dead Sea, other than the salt, it has a number of other chemicals in it also. There are several resorts around the Dead Sea that people go there to bathe in the water.
Right. Right. And actually, not too far from here, at one point, people used to do that, like Sour Lake, okay, which has now been drained after Exxon, or not Exxon, but Texaco. But that used to be a kind of a natural spring where a lot of people would go and float in there as well. Yeah.
It feels slick. It's so full of chemicals.
Right.
It literally feels like you got some oil or grease in your hand.
Which we will look to Clarence. Clarence has been to most of those locations, so we will kind of ask him some questions on these too. And then the other important river, and this is really the main river that you're going to see, is this Jordan River. And it basically goes from the edge of the Sea of Galilee, goes all the way down here, and actually Mount Hebron, which is up here, roughly it goes down, goes all the way throughout there. But it does empty into the Dead Sea. Okay, the Jordan River mentioned tons and times in the Bible, but those are the four bodies of water that we're going to discuss. Then we have these areas of elevation. And this is important just to kind of get a general idea, because these locations in a 10-mile area, okay, and I'm going to talk about this. Sea level's right here. This is the coastal plains right here. Okay, everything is sea level there. Over here, you're going to have mountains. Okay, so these are the little mountainous regions. But over here, we're going to have, let me skip across. This is going to be the hilly area. Okay, so within about a 10-mile area, you go from coastal plains to hills. Okay, the geography is completely different. The way of life is completely different. And if you look in the Old Testament, if you start paying attention in the maps, you'll kind of see there's a vast difference in terms of the way of life for those people. And then in the middle of this, which you kind of have this little green area right here. This is called the Shephelah. Oops, sorry. Here's the Dead Sea area. Dead Sea. From the hills over here to the Dead Sea, it drops drastically. Okay, it basically goes completely straight down. So it's kind of like a cliff. It goes all the way down. But in a very, very short amount of time, you go from a very high area to one of the lowest points in that region. Okay, and the Dead Sea is the lowest point in that region. So again, you have a lot of different things going on. But this area, okay, I'm going to hit all four of these here. You have the coastal plains right here, which is very, very lush. There's lots of vegetation, a lot of good farmland. Then the Shephelah, which is very, very pretty. Right here, you'll see lots of pictures right in there in the middle, which is also kind of this transition area. And then over here, again, you can kind of see the edge of this right here. Do you see how you have like some green and then it goes to completely like a rocky area? That's that hill country. Okay? So when we're talking about that, we'll kind of pay attention to that in the map as we go along through this class. All right? Now, the first thing we're going to kind of talk about is this, and it kind of seems like a dumb question, except this is a question you get all the time, okay? And this one is, was David real, right? And the reason for this, that I think we need to kind of discuss this, is because unless you've really been paying attention to your archaeological homework, up until about 2004, a lot of people had pretty good arguments with this in terms of people saying, well, David was a fictional character, much more like a King Arthur. Because if you look at the archaeological standpoint, there wasn't really a lot of things that actually spelled out David is a real person. Okay? And we're going to kind of talk about that because this first person we're going to look at, which here's the quote, says, I'm afraid that evidence regarding the magnificent Solomonic capital was not discovered because it is non-existent, not because it is still hidden in the ground. And that's from David Ushikin from the Tel Aviv University. And it was published, and a lot of people were looking at that. And then we have this one here. It says, archaeological data have now definitely confirmed that the empire of David and Solomon never existed. And that's from Niels Peter Lemke of the University of Copenhagen. All right? So if you look at this, a lot of people were saying, aha, David's kind of a myth. He's kind of a King Arthur. And that really caused a lot of people a lot of issues. We're going to look at this quote here, too. And this one, which quote do I have up here? Got some interesting animations here. Jane Cahill, okay, and she's a big one here. She is a very, very good archaeologist. She was around in the 50s. Now, before she came along, there was a lot of evidence in the Middle East. For instance, oh my goodness, they marched around the city, Jericho. Thank you, Jericho. Okay, the city of Jericho. And they looked at that, and the early archaeologists that looked at this, starting in the late 1880s, they were looking at this and are like, aha, this matches almost everything that you find in the Bible, okay? They found city walls that had fallen down, which they found. They found that it had been lit on fire, which they found. They also found, if you want to get a little bit more into detail with that, they also found that there was grain, okay, which is important because if you look at the biblical account of that, before the little siege of Jericho, there was Passover, which is the springtime. Okay, springtime is also the harvest in the Middle East. So it would make sense that there's grain. Okay, the other thing that's important with that too is if there's a siege, what's the first thing that usually disappears? Siege, like where people are surrounding your city, you can't exit your city. What disappears first? Food, because you can't get any other food. So if you found a fire and you found full barrels of grain in almost every house, What does that say? The siege was really short. Okay? How long did the Israelites march around Jericho? 7 days. Rather short period of time. Not to mention you have Rahab or Rahab. If you look at that, if you remember in that little story, what did they say would happen to her house? It would be saved, okay? But the city walls, and that there's one little city wall with a window in it, ironically, that's still around, okay? But you had Jane Cahill, and she said, the most frequently voiced argument by those who challenge the historical existence of the United Monarchy, that's right, is the supposed lack of archaeological evidence. And when we look at that, we have some issues with that because, again, if you kind of look at this, there are some archaeological evidence that a lot of people overlook, okay? And Jane Cahill is kind of the biggest critic of this that kind of actually was stating some different things. So she says, if you look at this, most frequently voiced argument by those who challenge the historical evidence of the United Monarchy is the supposed lack of archaeological evidence. In most cases, these arguments are either grossly misleading, illogical, disingenuous, or all three. And we're going to kind of look at some of those things, and then we'll kind of build this into David, okay? Because again, early archaeological evidence, there's not a lot that kind of mentions. So let's kind of look at some of the things that we have. First of all, one of the biggest arguments that you'll have from people is they will say, well, Israel didn't exist as a united kingdom, okay? It simply didn't exist till much, much later than when King David supposedly existed, okay? And to kind of differentiate with this one, you have this Merneptah stele, okay? And Merneptah is a pharaoh of Egypt, and this is kind of a victory stele, if you will. But they always call this an Israel stele as well. It was discovered in 1893. Merneptah was around in 1213 to 1203 BC, which is important because David existed around 1000 BC, all right? So if you look at this, first of all, we'll find that, first of all, the first half of this, he's just kind of bragging, and he's telling about all the countries that he has dominated, but then towards the end, he mentions as kind of an afterthought, he kind of mentions the other direction, and he mentions that he fought Israel, and he defeated Israel too. And in this inscription, kind of says, the princes are prostrate, saying, Shalom. Not one of the 9 bows lifts his head. Tinu is vanquished, Kadi at peace. Kind of skip down a little bit where it's bold. Says, Israel is wasted, bare of seed. Okay, so we do have Israel mentioned on this stele. And if you want to see, this is the actual part where it mentions Israel by name. But before this, you really have no archaeological evidence with Israel mentioned as a nation. Okay? And that kind of plays a part there too. Now this one, I'm going to kind of skip ahead here. I'm going to skip this little slide here. I'll mention this briefly. You have the Armani letters too, which is before this one as well. And this one goes a little bit further. But the interesting thing with this one is this one kind of talks about how Egypt went from a completely polytheistic society to a monotheistic society. The important thing with that one too is a lot of times if you look at the spelling, okay, sometimes they do a little bit of injustice with the spelling of some of the names. For instance, there's a pharaoh named Thutmosis, okay, and if you usually see the spelling of Thutmosis, it's usually Thutmosis, okay. Ironically, you can also change the spelling of that one to Moses, which looks like what biblical character? Moses, okay, which ironically is around the same time. Okay? And ironically, shortly after the reign of Thutmosis, you go from this polytheistic society to a society that for about a 100-year period, they go to a monotheistic society. But during this time, they kind of mentioned some of the reasons why they were doing this. You can kind of take that how you want, okay? Now, this is a Varus, okay? Now, Varus is going to be a very, very pivotal part, okay? And this is one of the first things that actually kind of show some interesting things. Because one of the first things that people were saying with Avaris, is this was also called the city of Ramses, okay? And if you look at the city of Ramses, let's go first, let's go to Genesis 47. Okay, So Genesis 47. And if we look in verse 11, just kind of want you to note this. It says, so Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had ordered. Okay? Now, a lot of people will talk about, especially with the Exodus, they will say, aha, the Exodus has to occur during the time of Pharaoh Ramses. Okay? And the reason for that is because shortly thereafter, there was a city called the city of Ramses, named in honor of Ramses. Okay? Now, I want you to kind of pay attention. This is found in Genesis, right? Genesis 47. So the other thing I want to point out, later on, this city of Avaris right here was later called Ramses. Okay, so Avaris is the first group of people that we have. You can kind of see Avaris is down here. Later on, it becomes Ramses. Okay, so they were looking at the city of Ramses. They knew where the city of Ramses is. When they were doing the archaeological evidence there, they were looking at it, and they found absolutely no traces of Semitic people at all. Okay, so no Jewish population at all. And how do you know it's a Jewish population? Well, first of all, Jewish people, you have some certain customs. Okay, what can they not eat? Can't eat pork. Okay, Canaanites around that area, they ate lots of pork. Actually, like 80% of their diet consisted of pork. Okay, so there's certain bones that would be left around that would kind of show you, first of all, what types of foods would be around to kind of prove this. Okay, when they were doing the early studies of the city of Ramses, they said, aha, there's no Jewish people here whatsoever. We're finding all these pig bones. There's no shrines to Jewish people whatsoever. Nothing around there suggesting this. But look, that's Genesis 47. I also want you to point out, let's see, where's the next verse? Go to Exodus 1. Look at here as well. Exodus 1, and if you look in verse 11 on this one, again it says, so they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. Okay, so you have two locations where they kind of spell out in the Bible. These are the two locations. These are where the Israelite people were being worked, building all the straw, everything else. This is where they are being worked at. Okay, now also kind of point out, let's go to Exodus 12:37. And in 12:37 of Exodus, it says, now the sons of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from the children. So we kind of see as the Exodus occurs, again, they're going to be leaving this area. Interesting part, though, if you start thinking about this one, is, first of all, the first location of the city of Ramses was mentioned in Genesis, right? Okay, and in that first account, who was coming in there? Who was coming in there at the end of Genesis? What? No. Not Moses. So Joseph settled. Okay? So you have Joseph. Okay? Now, first of all, you have to kind of think about too. When you're looking at the first 5 books of the Bible, who wrote the first books of the Bible? Who do they usually say wrote the first books of the Bible? Moses. Okay? And pretty much everyone agrees Moses wrote the first several books of the Bible. But I want to point out one thing at the end of Exodus. Let's go to Exodus 40. I said that. Okay, at the end of, actually I said that. That's not where I want. Okay, in the first 5 books of the Bible, what also happens to Moses? This is kind of where I'm wanting to go with this. What happens to Moses at the very end? Does Moses get to enter the promised land? No. So right before Joshua enters, the very beginning of Joshua, like Joshua 3, they start to cross the Red Sea. But at the very beginning of that, actually I'm looking for Deuteronomy 34. That's what I'm looking for. Okay, at the end of Deuteronomy 34, we see the death of Moses, right? If Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, How did Moses write about his death? How did he write that section? That's the interesting part, okay? Someone probably wrote that last little section of Moses, okay? But the other thing I want to point out too, if we talked about just common places, okay? If I said New Netherlands, okay? We're talking about the United States here. Where's New Netherlands? It's not Europe, okay? It's actually in the United States. How about New Amsterdam? What? New York, okay? All three are the same location in New York, okay? If we're doing a history of New York, what I write, we're going to now talk about the history of New Amsterdam. Would we talk about that? We would actually go through and we'd actually call it what people were calling it currently, okay? And the one point I want to point out with this one is the city of Ramses was not called the city of Ramses for a long period of time, which means at the end of Genesis 47, when we see the city of Ramses mentioned there, and also in Exodus is mentioned as the city of Ramses, something doesn't line up there, okay? Someone put that in there to kind of say, this is the location you're familiar with as the city of Ramses. And when you kind of go with that thought process is, if you look at this, they started digging down a little bit deeper, okay? And they started looking at this as the city that was there, the city of Ramses before the city of Ramses, which was called Avaris, okay? And the interesting thing is, when they looked at the city of Avaris, first of all, they see there was a Semitic population there. Ironically, there was a large Semitic population. Again, they looked at the bones that you found in that part of the city, and they found that it was basically only kosher food that you would actually have there. You also found that the house styles were actually built in a way that was non-Egyptian. Even more interesting is they found a larger house that was kind of built as a Canaanite style. And then when they started looking at this house, there were some interesting things. They saw it was leveled. And then later on, there was a palace that was built in this area, okay? The interesting thing with this palace is, first of all, there's this little part right here in the middle in this little portico area. There are 12 columns there. Interesting, okay? Because if you start looking at this, you start thinking about who was a large person in this area, in the city of Avaris or the city of Ramses. Who moved to the city of Ramses at the end of Genesis? Joseph, okay? So you have a large area there with 12 little pillars. We also start to see there are 12 tombs behind the palace, and then in one of those tombs, there was a pyramid shape that was built there, and also kind of showing the power of a pharaoh. Because the one thing that you have there is, first of all, the only people that were allowed to have a pyramid tomb were either kings or queens. Okay? So why in the world would you have a person who was not a king or a queen who was given power to actually have a pyramid-type tomb? Okay? Not only that, but inside this pyramid tomb, there is the remnants of a statue. The statue, and this kind of gives you a computer little aided little drawing. Okay, there's the palace there. Behind it, you have these little 12 tombs. And then over here, you have one larger tomb than everything else there. But in this one tomb that you have, again, you have a large little statue that's built there. They found out that this statue is not an Egyptian. The reason they can prove that is, first of all, you're going to see at the little top, you have this red hair, which is kind of like this little mushroom cut at the top. Okay? They also found flakes of yellow paint on the skin, okay, which was a way that they kind of designated non-Egyptian. Okay? They pointed it was kind of a way to show it was a paler person. Again, you don't have this little person. And the other interesting thing is on the statue, if you start looking on the shoulders, which you can kind of see very, why am I pointing to that one? Over here, you can kind of see remnants of color. Okay, and kind of a computer aided there to kind of show this a little bit more. You have a multicolored coat. Okay, interesting. Okay, if you start looking at this, who does this start to look more and more like? Joseph, okay? Because Joseph was given power. If you look at that, Pharaoh gave Joseph tons and tons of power. People were coming to him. He kind of had the power. He also had a little staff, this statue that is, kind of showing the power of the Pharaoh as well. But the other thing is, for a Jewish perspective, what's the importance of the 12 columns now? The brothers. Yeah, you have 12 brothers. You have 12 little areas or 12 little memorials for the brothers. Not only that, but you also, with the little coat here that has multicolored, you have a multicolored coat, okay? Looks stranger and stranger and stranger as who would this person be? If this is not Joseph, then you have someone else in history who looks so much like Joseph, it's ridiculous. Okay? You can kind of see this is kind of a little computer-aided little rendition of what the statue would have looked like when it's done. Okay? And then we have this next little area. And this is Kirbet Qeiyafa. And the one thing that we have with this is a relatively recent discovery here. Okay? And this is the first thing, and I kind of want you to kind of make a note of this. This is the first notation that you actually have of Saul or David. Okay? And this little area right here started in 2007. Okay? The excavation started. So this is relatively new. All right? And the one thing that you have, they dated it from the time of David, which we see this as well. They found that it is a Jewish location. And you can kind of see, let's go to 1 Samuel 17. Let's look at this one too. Okay, and in 1 Samuel 17, verse 52, we're going to see the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the valley and to the gates of Ekron, and the slain Philistines lay along the way to Shaaraim, even to Gath and Ekron. Okay, this is the city of Shaaraim. Okay, they called it Kirbet Qeiyafa as well, but this is the biblical city that we have there. Now, this is the area. We just kind of looked. This is the area with David and Goliath. Okay, this is kind of most likely. This is probably the area where a lot of the Israelites were camped right before the battle with David and Goliath. Okay, the interesting thing with this one as well is that this one actually has 2 gates. Okay, as mentioned in the Bible. This is the only city that they found from this time period that, first of all, has heavily fortified walls, but more importantly, this is the only city that they found that actually had 2 gates. Okay? The reason that this is important is a lot of people who were biblical critics and kind of archaeological critics said, well, there was no city at all that existed that had 2 gates. Well, they found it. Okay? And this one actually has 2 gates. And if you look at this, there is a gate right here on the side, and then there is a gate back here on this side right there as well. Both of the gates are the same dimensions, but again, no other city at all existed that had 2 gates. So we have that. Now, the important part with that, there was a lot of stuff that was left over in here. Okay? One of the things that they found is they found this little artifact that we see right here. And the important part with this one is that we have some interesting things with some technical terms. Okay? Because in the Bible, for instance, if we set a plumb line, what is a plumb line? It makes things straight, okay? It has a little thing called the plumb, and you have a line, and it actually tells you if things are level, okay? If we mention that term, and we mention to a lot of people, are people going to understand that term if we were talking to people 200, 300 years ago? Possibly not, okay? And the main point is a lot of the technical terms that we have, a lot of times people don't really understand that. But one of the things they found is they found this little statue here, okay? And this is kind of an interesting thing because let's go to 1 Kings 7. Okay, now this is after the life of David. Okay, it says, now Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished all his house. He built the house of the first forest of Lebanon. His length was 100 cubits, and his width 50 cubits, and his height of 30 cubits, on 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams on the pillars. It was paneled with cedar above the side chambers, which were on the 45 pillars, 15 in each row. There were artistic window frames in 3 rows. Key point is verse 4. How many of you have artistic is italicized? What do you guys have in verse 4? Did any of you have like 9 windows mentioned or anything? Okay. The key point is that word they're struggling with, where in mine translation, artistic is where they have this, where it says artistic window frames in 3 rows, and window was opposite window in 3 ranks, okay? Or sometimes you might see it as 9 windows. What they're trying to do is, do you see how you have 1, 2, 3? Do you see how you have this little indented little walls right there with 3? That's kind of what they're trying to mention here, okay? This is the first, and this is the only one that you actually have in terms of the explanation of what they were trying to do. Now, the reason this is important is because if you look during the life of David, David was helping prepare for the temple, Okay, you had people that were coming in trying to prepare models and things like this, but this is kind of what they're thinking that you have. So if you look at this, this is more or less the windows that you would have on-side the temple, and sometimes they would have as triglyphs. We're skipping through part of this here. Okay, but it's a recessed doorway. Okay, and you'll see this mentioned 1 Kings 6:5 and also 31 through 33 of that. Okay, interesting. But the other part that you have here is you have this next thing here, which is the ostracon. Okay, and this is on the remnants of pottery. Okay, and again, the pottery was dated to the time of Saul. And one of the things it says, do not oppress and serve God, despoiled him. The judge and the widow wept. He had the power over the resident alien and the child. He eliminated them together. The men and chiefs, officers have established a king. He marked 60 servants among the community's habitations, generations. The key part is that bottom part, okay, when they're talking about they have established a king, okay, because now if you have something from the time of Saul, now what do you actually have justification for? Yes, you have proof that there was a king. You have a proof that there was a united kingdom, okay? This is a huge, huge point, okay, because this is the first time that you actually say that there was an established kingdom around the time of Saul and David, okay? And the critics, a lot of people had no idea what to do with this because everything they were saying did not exist, then started to exist, okay? Before that, the only thing we actually had was the Tel Dan stele. And the Tel Dan stele is dated from the 9th century BC, so roughly it's 100 years after David existed, okay? And on this, again, these are the Arameans. They were kind of boasting of their conquest, and one of the things that they actually mention is that they mention, first of all, the king of Israel. They also mention he was a king of the house of David, okay? This is the first, and this is the only time that you have any mention of David around that time, okay? But the important part is now you're actually having pottery and artwork of other people, of other nations actually shouting and saying that there is a king, a kingdom of Israel, but not only that, he's the lineage of David, okay? Which is important because, first of all, who is the biggest king during between Saul, David, and Solomon? Who's the most wealthy of those three? Solomon by far. Okay, so if you're thinking about this, wouldn't it make more sense for you to actually start shouting about the King Solomon? Okay, but they're still pointing to King David. Okay, and they actually call him out by King David. So you see the house of David mentioned here, and we kind of see first of all David was real. We also see David was still remembered 100 years after his death, and here's kind of the inscription, which basically doesn't say anything except there was a house of David. Okay. All right. And then the other thing we have, inside Jerusalem itself, again, kind of pointing to some of the archaeology of this little time period, we also have these bulli, okay? And the bulli are basically kind of wax seals, okay? And they're put on all sorts of documentation, things like this. Now, the one thing you have to realize is a lot of times if you're looking at the city of David, okay, and if you're trying to look for archaeological remains kind of shouting of David's conquest and things like this, you had different people that came in and conquered them and destroyed the city several times. So you don't have a lot of the first-hand stuff that would actually shout about David, okay? Ironically, in the city of David, you actually had from one of those little fires and one of those conquests, you found a room. And inside the room, you had all of these bulli who had been hardened by the fire, and you still had these representations of them. Now, the important thing or interesting thing is they were found in the city of David. They were on approved digs. Okay, so you actually have documentation from the city proving that these things were there. They weren't just placed there. They were found within a few feet of each other, okay, in one room. Okay, and they found them in 2 different years. 2008, they found the first little batch, and then in the neighboring room, they found the second one is 2010. But the important part is, if you look in Jeremiah 38:1, okay, it says, now Shephatiah, the son of Mattan, and Gedaliah, the son of Pashur, and Jukal, the son of Shelemiah, and Pashur, the son of Malchijah, heard the words that Jeremiah was speaking to all the people, saying, okay, they found seals for everyone that's in red. Okay, so in that one verse alone, you found 3 people from the same time period mentioning these people. Okay, so when you're looking at this, you're finding archaeological evidence that are kind of proving that the Bible is very true. Okay, not to mention most recently, they also started finding locations where the tomb of David and Solomon was. Okay, we will pick that up there Wednesday, and then we will actually start talking about the life of David, which we'll start picking that up as well.